And joining us now on the debate in Vancouver, British Columbia, Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party of Canada. In New York, New York, Paul Rubin, professor of economics at Emory University. Here in studio, Stephen Drakeford, Anglican Minister at St. Matthew's, that's in Etobicoke, and head of the Environmental Working Group at the Diocese of Toronto. Joshua Loughran, Director of Communications for WWF Canada. And in New York, New York, we welcome back Lionel, co-author of God's Brain. Good to have everybody both here in the studio and in Points Beyond for our discussion tonight about environmentalism as an ideology. We're in the midst of a four-part series? I think it's a four-part series on ideologies, and tonight we talk environmentalism. And, you know, it'd be good to have somebody who knew both the environment and religion to do this. And Elizabeth May, since you used to teach Sunday school before you got into politics, I'm going to start with you on this one. If we define ideology as a set of aims and ideas that directs one's goals, expectations, and actions, is environmentalism an ideology?
I don't believe so, Stephen. I certainly know it's not a religion. Environmental concerns come from empirical evidence, from science. They're fact-based. Those things that, as Lionel talks about, are brain-soothing, are those things that nourish us, relax us, restore us. I can promise you working on environmental issues is a stressful business, and based on facts and based on information that we have to take action. You bring to bear your own ideologies to that struggle, and certainly parties that are generally of the left will have advanced certain kinds of solutions to environmental problems. Parties of the right will, for instance, lean towards more market mechanisms, and other parties might lean towards regulation. We're very pragmatic. We'll use whatever works. But I think it's a pejorative attack on the importance and the imperative of taking action to protect the environment, to denigrate it by saying, oh, this is just some form of a new religion. I don't know anyone other than people who are avowedly pagan who actually are worshiping nature. A lot of people recognize that if we don't protect the planet on which we live as a matter of pure science, our future looks pretty bleak. And
let me just clarify, you did say pagan and not pagan there. I just want to make sure that's out there.
Well, I do worship you, Steve, but I didn't want to mention it tonight.
That's very good of you. Thank you. And, you know, it's possible that she might, because we share the same birthday. I should just clarify that as well. So happy birthday next month.
That's very exciting.
Stephen Drakeford, what do you say on the same question?
What
environmentalism as an ideology?
I think potentially it could be. I think it could be a sort of a religion for certain people, and I think everything's on a kind of a continuum. People will approach things that are important to them, and they will build their lives around them. And so potentially, I suppose environmentalism can be some sort of religion for some that meets all their needs and soothes their brain and those kinds of things.
So you're not rejecting it outright like Elizabeth May just did.
Oh gosh, I'm crossing Elizabeth May already, and
and it's only 20 after 8.
Yeah, no. I think potentially for anyone. I mean, anyone can make anything a religion. Is really what it boils down to. It's what you organize your life around. Most environmentalists probably it's not a religion for them, but for some, it probably does meet all their needs.
Paul Rubin.
Yeah, I think it has many aspects of a religion. People do things. You know, people who are religious will pray. People who are environmentalists will do things that probably are not very productive in terms of their own goals. I talked tonight about recycling, for example. If you really believe in trees, then if you recycle paper, an economist will tell you the long-run effect is going to be to reduce the number of trees, as reduce demand for new land to plant trees on for paper, and yet recycling is something that people think is a remarkable thing to do. People are opposed, say, to nuclear power, which is the cleanest power we know, and yet environmentalists will stand back in horror when they hear nuclear power. So I think there are sort of irrational aspects to environmentalism, and I think to the extent that you can't examine them rationally and consider them in an open framework, that you get some of the aspects of religion.
Okay, hold off on the nuclear stuff because I'm going to get to that in 1 minute, Josh. But come on in here on the general issue of environmentalism as an ideology. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a useful metaphor, and perhaps I'll even give it an analogy, but not much further than that. I mean, Elizabeth is right that it is testable and it is fact-based. I don't believe that passenger pigeons are extinct because of an article of faith. I believe it because scientists tell me there aren't any more out there. But our response to declines in the environment, to declines in fresh water or climate change or loss of species is a value-based response and a public policy issue. So that does invoke values, and then you have difference of opinion about what the best allocation of resources or decisions you're going to make on it. And that does bring in values, but I think it's far too great a stretch to suggest that it's irrational to believe that declines in our fresh water or declines in our air quality don't affect either ourselves or future generations, and that's an irrational debate for people to have.
Well, let me put that idea of morality and values to Lionel Tiger and get you to come in and talk about that. If those who believe in religion believe that it has values at its base, morality at its base, can you say the same thing for environmentalism?
The first comments about the fact that dirty water is dirty and the environment, the air which smells is smelly, is not a value judgment, it's an aesthetic value. And if you're an economist, you notice that people tend to want to live where the air is clean, where there's a clean body of water, where there's circulation of air. So in that sense, the value of the environment actually has an economic value. Now, this has gotten confounded by the right-left split that was already mentioned, because, for example, the French, who are historically both left and right at the same time, which confuses them immensely, nonetheless have possibly the world's best nuclear energy system. They produce 80% of their power in nuclear form. It's been safe for generations. And yet that coexists with their environmental movement. The Green Party in the last election, which had gotten the ecology, the party run by Cohn-Bendit and one other fellow whose name I now can't remember, got 6.3% of the vote in the last election, but in the most recent one, they changed their name to the Green Party and they got 23%, almost as much as the Socialist Party. So it's not just that it's paradoxical or a metaphor, it's confused.
Okay, let me try this on nuclear, because Paul waved a big red flag in front of Elizabeth May's face, even though they're 3,000 miles apart. And to that end, I'm going to read this that we got from an energy consultant in Ottawa named Steve Applin, who wrote this into us. I've often marveled, he writes, at the behavioral similarities between the official representatives of the environment, who are almost all anti-nuclear, and the adherents of some religious and political orders. These similarities are most striking when it comes to promulgation and dissemination of dogma and the treatment of apostates. The salient characteristic of dogmatists is their adherence to dogma in the face of overwhelming evidence that contradicts it. In the case of anti-nuclear activists, their claims that nuclear energy is dangerous, inefficient, and ineffective in cutting greenhouse gases all run contrary to easily verified public information. And yet all of the major mainstream environmental groups, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Environmental Defense, Friends of the Earth, Josh, WWF isn't there, but you can tell us whether you're on the list too. They're all anti-nuclear. Their dogmatic stance against the technology has led them to actually support the increased use of fossil fuels, as witnessed the situation here in Ontario, where the mainstream environmental groups actually support the construction of a natural gas generating plant on the Holland Marsh. The use of moralistic, rhetorical manipulation in the service of herd control is characteristic of the more negative forms of religious and political fanaticism. Okay, Liz May, you're on.
Well, Steve, of course, the case that has just been put to you and to all of the audience on nuclear isn't fact-based. That in itself is a form of dogma, the assumption that somehow nuclear is clean, the assumption that it's reliable, or that it's a solution to the climate crisis. There's an equal and large body of evidence from people who are energy analysts around the world who say, look, if we're going to reduce greenhouse gases, what is the most cost-effective way? What form of political and policy action will reduce greenhouse gases by the greatest amount per dollar invested, create the most jobs per dollar invested? In other words, where in the hierarchy of options should we put our emphasis?
So you're not buying the premise at all.
And in that analysis, nuclear is about at the bottom. The top choice is to improve energy efficiencies and energy productivity, to bring on renewables. And I can tell you that I re-examine nuclear on a regular basis because I'm not dogmatic. I want a solution to the climate crisis that works, and we have lots and lots of solutions. Nuclear isn't one of them. It's way down the list harvest in terms of its upfront huge capital cost, the long timeline to get it working, and of course that it has proven to be unreliable. And in the same way, Professor Rubin's nonsense about, sorry, Mr. Rubin, but the idea that recycling makes no sense, a lot of economists have looked at this, and the Forest Products Association of Canada is very clear on this. The more that we can recycle, not only does it avoid cutting down forests, which is something the Forest Products Association really likes to do, but it's again energy efficient, it makes a lot of sense, and it harvests an urban forest, which otherwise is just wasted in landfills. So you really need to bring a thorough critical analysis to all of these points. And there's a lot of dogma on all sides, but this is a particularly, I'd say, a straw man for me to knock down.
Okay, Paul Rubin, she's not buying. You want to come back?
Well, I think we could debate nuclear all day, but you know, as you said, France is very successful, or as Lionel said, very successful at generating lots of power from nuclear. As far as danger, we had 3 Mile Island here, which really caused no harm to anyone. Chernobyl, of course, was very dangerous, but that was built in another regime. But in terms of safety,
well,
I think there's been. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just say Dr. Sternglass would disagree with you in the studies of cancer post 3 Mile Island that there was in fact quite a lot of damage to the human population
I'm going to jump in here,
3 Mile
folks.
Island.
I'm going to jump in only because I'm not sure we want to turn this into a program where we debate the merits of nuclear power. However, the issue of dogma on one side versus dogma on another, and whether that gets us into the realm of environmentalism as an ideology or as a religion, I do want to go there. So, Paul, under those conditions, you want to pick up on that, go ahead.
Well, again, the question is it's sort of related to the value of nuclear, because there are many people who don't think about it and don't look at it and immediately reject it. You know, and don't, as I say, we have the example of France. People don't seem willing to consider that. There are fairly inexpensive reactors, less expensive, that can be built and have been built successfully, and yet we have people who react strongly against it. So I think that is, to me, that is a dogma that people just reject it out of hand and say, no, this is something that we really can't look at.
Josh Lochran, what do you say on that?
Well, I mean, I think the very fact that we're actually debating it based on evidence, even if we agree on the weighting of that evidence, it is a sign that it's not based on dogma or article of faith, but on different assessment of risk.
Are you anti-nuke?
I mean, I think Elizabeth nailed it, where nuclear just has not delivered on a cost basis or an efficiency basis. I mean, the Ontario government just shelved its potential plans for nuclear plants, not because of an article of faith, but because the cost simply made everyone stand up and cough. It was way out of whack with what we could afford, and not nearly the cheap way to produce energy that had been touted as. So, I mean, I think that there are risks with nuclear energy. We can argue about how we want to assess those risks and what degree of risk we'll accept as a society. There's a value-based judgment, again, about how much we want to put off those risks to future generations, and how the burden we'll put on future generations to deal with radioactive waste, which is a byproduct of nuclear power. And that's a fact-based, and yes, values come into play, but it's a fact-based debate that isn't constrained by ideology or faith.
Okay, you're all making the fact-based case tonight against, or those of you who are making a fact-based case against nuclear. However, Lionel Tiger, let me put this to you. I certainly have interviewed plenty of environmentalists over the years who do not use the fact-based approach to shoot down nuclear power, but do so with the same fervor, fundamentalism, dare I call it fanaticism, that you might see in some very religious people. You want to pick up on that angle?
Well, again, here I'm quite empirical. I drive around France a lot, and I actually am not by any means an expert on nuclear power, of course. I do know that Canada was in at the outset with its CANDU reactors, and there was a big question whether the Canadian system would work or the Westinghouse system would work. The French seem to, with Areva, seem to have figured out a way to do this, and apparently increasingly cheaply. But it seems to me that there's something else that we're missing here, which is the role of environmentalism as a source of benign participation. I happened to be at a little school event of my granddaughter, who's 4, and in her classroom the walls were plastered, wasting a lot of paper, I should say, with signs saying recycle, 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 recycle. I thought I was in a bicycle shop, but the fact was that these kids are being taught this very early on, and nonetheless, there we were having little bits of cake and bottled water on plastic plates, which are thrown into the dump. So the amount of hypocrisy and confusion about this, as with Al Gore using a private plane, for example, is immense. I'm not saying this to be critical of environmentalists, because I have lived in polluted, awful places, and I hated living there, and I much prefer where I now live, where the air is cleaner and the waters are cleaner, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to make a distinction between environmentalism, ideology, and acts of benign participation, as I just called them.
Okay.
And that, I think, is wholesome, so long as it doesn't disturb the horses.
Okay, disturb the horses. Very good. Let me see if I can hopefully not blur those lines even further. But do you see, Stephen, a kind of religiosity, if you will, in the way that some environmentalists oppose nuclear power, oppose mining, oppose logging, oppose a lot of other things that employ a lot of people, and where the story may be a little more complicated than is suggested?
A very quick answer, and I said, yeah, absolutely. I think that's, you know, people do take it in that direction. Listening to the conversation, though, if I might want to take it sort of in a slightly different direction, because we're talking about how we can continue to produce at the level in which we can continue to grow and our economies can grow. And it seems to me that the fundamental problem, and this is where it intersects with faith for me, the fundamental problem is our overconsumption. And that is both a kind of a religious, that is a spiritual issue that really needs to be addressed. I mean, we can talk a long time about how we can get more power and more energy resources at our fingertips. But the fundamental issue for me really is that we are overconsumers, and that's what we have to begin to address.
In which case, Elizabeth May, is there a fundamental clash? Is there an impossibility of resolving the issues between capitalism and environmentalism?
Oh, not at all. I mean, and this is where the question of how one brings to bear your own ideology on the question of the environment. But there are a lot of economists out there who are making really interesting cases for how an economy goes forward in a stable and sustainable and even a steady state fashion, which is not incompatible with capitalism at all. Or you can look to authors like Paul Hawken, who talked about natural capitalism. There's a tremendous range of views, and so it's not a question of saying they're incompatible or you can't resolve it. The question is, do you want to resolve it? And once you have political will that says, look, this is, you know, environmental challenges require a response in the near term, or we will, you know, have committed some very serious errors that affect all future generations. Then you say, well, what policy tools do we bring to that? Well, one of them, frankly, is the market forces and harnessing the economy we've got to be a better, greener economy. And that really requires some leadership. But they're not incompatible. I mean, I just say, as we've been talking, Steve, it occurred to me to think, you know, all the things that you're ascribing, and some of these articles ascribe to the notion of environmentalism as a religion, you could just as easily, for fun, decide that the national religion of Canada is hockey, and that, you know, the Stanley Cup is the Holy Grail, and we all pursue it in a ritualized fashion. You can say it for sake of argument, but again, I don't think it applies to environmentalism or hockey to say it's a religion. I think we bring our own values, our own religious traditions, our own ideological baggage to whatever problem we face, and the problem we face around climate change is a big one.
And using your analogy, as a Leaf fan, I'm in hell right now seeing how well the Montreal Canadiens are doing. So anyway, but again, another story for another program.
Well, you obviously did something wrong in your various ritualized activities.
I know, I'm a Leaf fan. There you go. Lionel, I see you trying to get in.
Well, I was just going to comment that the world of other animals gives us a clue here. In our book, we have a chapter on Chimpanzee religion. Chimps are very interesting because, like us, they're intensely group-based. They have discernible social structures. They have ways of keeping boundaries of their groups. They can be quite nasty to people, chimps, in other groups, and they can destroy them if they are frightened of them. But they also take advantage of nature, and one of the things that we were very interested in was what has been observed, namely a kind of church service among chimps. That is, after they've had their breakfast, they've gathered their fruits and nuts and whatever they want, and they've broken down their nests for last night, and they've established their social connections again. They move often to a sort of cathedral-like copse where there's a bit of a meadow and there are trees and it's quiet, and then they just sit there. And the dominant male, who's usually bossing people around and trying to scare everybody, is quite quiescent, and individuals groom each other, the youngsters play, and it's almost as if it has a church quality. And that, I think, in part speaks to their use of their environment.
Okay,
and
let me try another analogy here, if I can, that our environmental friends here may not go for, but I'll try this anyway. Robert Sibley wrote about this in the Ottawa Citizen a couple of years ago. Environmentalism, like fascism and communism, two secular religions of the 20th century, has become another secular religion. So says Robert. The making of environmentalism into a secular religion replete with its own green prophets, Al Gore, David Suzuki come to mind, has been a long time coming. Nearly 3 decades ago, sociologist Robert Nisbet warned that environmentalism is now well on its way to becoming the third great wave of the redemptive struggle in Western history, the first being Christianity, the second modern socialism. The dream of a perfect physical environment has all the revolutionary potential that lay both in the Christian version of mankind redeemed by Christ and in the socialist, chiefly Marxist prophecy of mankind freed from social injustice. Okay, Josh, to you first on that. These similarities between religion and environmentalism, the prophets, the self-sacrifice, the rituals. Are we pushing it here?
More than that. I mean, I think the fact that religion is so pervasive in our society means it lends itself well to the metaphors. So when we say the Stanley Cup is our Holy Grail, we all know exactly what we mean by that. I don't think any of us think that we actually are searching for the Holy Grail in our search for the cup, but it's a useful analogy, and I would say it's the same. It's too easy to apply that metaphor to environmentalism, and then draw that next step and say, therefore, it is a religion. And I think, I mean, if I can be allowed my own analogy to it, if we're in a boat steaming across the ocean and there's evidence that the boat is taking on water, you can have a debate about whether or not we need to plug that hole, or you can debate that will force us to slow down our progress and we can't afford to do that. That is a fact-based discussion that I would argue is based on how you value progress across the ocean versus keeping the ship afloat. I don't think it's fair to say that because I want to slow down the boat and fix the hole, that therefore I've created a god of hole plugging and then I'm worshiping carpentry tools. I think that's way too strong and too easy an argument against what is a pragmatic assessment of risk and of values.
Paul Rubin, haven't heard from you in a bit.
Sorry,
stand by, Elizabeth May, I'll get right back to you, but let me hear Paul Rubin on this first.
Well, maybe I'd like to go back to something Elizabeth said about capitalism, because I think I agree with her on that point, that to the extent that we want to do environmental things, we can use markets to do them. And I think hearing environmentalists say that is something that one would not have heard 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that's an advance. I think we have to be careful in using markets, and I think there is a tendency among environmentalists to look for central control and to look for government to have more power to do things. But if we're willing to rely more on markets and get prices right, then I think we can use capitalism to achieve whatever goals we want. The question, of course, is to what extent do we want environmental goals? I mean, global warming may or may not be a problem. I don't think we should get into that debate, but I think there are lots of other things we could think about. Lomberg has talked about we should do more research. We really don't know what to do about global warming, and there are various other proposals, but immediately people say, no, we have to stop consuming and reduce consumption and cut back. And I don't think that's a solution to global warming. And of course, we can talk about overconsumption, but we here in the West are quite wealthy. Much of the rest of the world is not. And if we say, well, they have to stay at their levels of consumption that they have now, that's going to be a very hard sell for the Chinese or the Indians, and I think with good reason.
Elizabeth May, I wonder, do you want to pick up on the boat analogy of Josh Loughran's or the prophet analogy of Al Gore and David Suzuki? Which one?
Well, basically in response to that article that you quoted from Sibley, the idea that you can, by extension, and I think Josh did a great job smashing it to bits as a notion, but the idea that environmentalism can be compared to fascism is not only wrong, it's deeply dangerous, and it's part of a propaganda movement to stop the much needed responses to the climate crisis, which is real. There's no debate among scientists about the climate crisis issue. We're very clear globally. We have an understanding the world has to move. The failure in Copenhagen does not take it off the agenda. Unfortunately, it's removed it from a lot of media coverage, but we're coming up to a G20 summit in Toronto where Canada's host government is saying we want to keep climate change off the agenda. That's something Canadians need to know. That's a practical political reality in terms of a scientific and verifiable real crisis where we're taking the wrong approach. It's not really helpful in that context to then say people who are upset about this can be treated, pejoratively as some sort of delusional religious fanatics. The science around climate change is solid, and people who respond to that are responsible citizens.
At the risk of getting us off track here, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say there is no debate among scientists as to the reality of climate change?
Not among those who actually are publishing in the scientific literature on the climate change issue. You can find thousands of geologists working in the petroleum industry, and in that context they are scientists who will sign petitions who say they don't think that there's an issue. But between the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been reviewed and approved as solid by every National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, the Brits, right around the world. Every National Academy of Science operating independently has confirmed the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On the essential facts of the climate issue, there is no debate. Okay,
but getting us back on track then here. Stephen Drakeford, let me put this to you. Some people, sometimes you see people on television talking about religion, and if you're watching, some people say, who elected you to talk on behalf of religion or talk on behalf of God? In the same way, some people say, who picked Josh Loughran here to talk on behalf of the environment? Or who picked Elizabeth May to talk on behalf of the environment? As if these people were self-appointed. Do you see any corollaries here at all?
I'm not so sure I actually follow your question.
Darn, I was afraid you were going to say that, because that was a long wind-up, and I don't want to go through that all over again.
I'm so sorry.
Go back to David Suzuki.
Go ahead, Lionel.
No, I was just making a joke or trying to. You're
being mischievous there. Okay, well, all right, Josh, who elected you to be the spokesperson for the environment? Let's make it simple like that.
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear. I'm with WWF, and I'm here because I'm representative of the World Wildlife Fund. And the only reason that WWF has any credibility is one that what we say gets tested against empirical data and finds to be at least reasonable and rational, and second, that we represent a base of support that gives us a voice. And if we lose that base of support, then I'm not here today. It's only because WWF is recognized and supported by millions of people around the world that I have a voice to say on issues of the environment.
Paul Rubin, do you see any difficulty between those who claim to speak for God and those who claim to speak for the environment?
Well, they're sometimes self-appointed, and of course, as Stephen said, there are lots of people supporting them. But then, as Lionel pointed out, you go to the schools and you see signs on the wall and people being indoctrinated that are very, I would say, indoctrinated, educated if you like, but at a very young age. And so they grow up and they feel that this is the way the world is, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. But I think society is, in my view, overemphasizing certain kinds of things and indoctrinating. Students come to Emory and they're all gung ho about the environment because of what they've learned in school, and they don't really learn some of the costs. As an economist, I would think about the cost of some of the things they want to do and what's the most efficient way to do them. And we often don't choose the most efficient goals, the most efficient methods of achieving the goals, even if the goals are themselves useful.
Okay, let's move into the final segment of our discussion here. And Stephen, I'm going to bring you in for this because we're going to call this chapter God is the New Green. Okay. Sorry, apologies to those of you who don't like that cheeky little way we're putting it, but here's the
You are putting forward that God's on our side in the Green Party. This is the thesis for the next section.
That's right.
Okay, well done. Okay, you got this, right? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now it's our job to look after them. This is an ad in a daily freebie newspaper given out on the subway system in Toronto by the Anglican Diocese of Toronto, a proud supporter of Earth Day. I mean, the merger between religion and the planet seems pretty clear here, and I wonder whether the church is trying to market itself to people whom it may have lost into the green movement.
Well, potentially, there is a possibility about that. I mean, the church has never been a stranger to sort of taking sort of cultural waves that have taken place in various cultures and using them to sort of say, and we are actually connected to that. I mean, the dating of Christmas and Easter and all that sort of related to sort of pagan festivals and that kind of thing. So on one level, you could say, yeah, absolutely, the church is sort of buying into it. But I think on a much deeper and perhaps more meaningful level, the church, because of its emerging awareness of the environmental disasters that are taking place, is beginning to say, you know, we've not necessarily been good caretakers of this planet. It's become apparent to us, and we actually need to rethink how we look at the world, look at creation. We need to rethink our basic Old Testament and biblical texts as to the mandate to care for creation. And so what we're simply doing is we're saying we are sorry in some senses that we haven't done a good job at reminding people of their relationship to creation. We're reconnecting with that, and so that's very simply what we're doing.
Elizabeth May, let me get you to follow up on that if I can. Do you think that the church is trying to market itself to people that it may have lost to the green movement?
Well, I can't tell you what the motivation of any particular church might have been. I don't think that that is necessarily the conclusion from seeing those kinds of ads. I mean, I'm going to be very careful here and clear to say that the Green Party of Canada is not a political organization that has any religion nor sees a role for religion in politics. But I know you know that I'm also a practicing Anglican, and I think there's a fascinating and interesting role that's happening from religions all around the world taking some responsibility around what role do religious voices have in the current debates that take place, and in the same sense that I think environmentalism can be understood not as a religion, but as a a response, a movement response to a threat to a problem. In that sense, it's classed with, I would say, the abolition movement against slavery, or women's suffrage movement, or the civil rights movement, and in those movements, there's often been a role for religious voices, and I think that's where we can see that particular voice coming to the fore from a number of major world religions.
Stephen?
Well, I was just simply going to say, in those movements, there's often been the foundation of the movement has been from religious voices. Particularly, you think of William Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, the suffragette movement in the turn of the last century was largely sort of based in women's church movements and that kind of thing. So I think there has been sort of an emergence of Christians, I'll speak for Christians in particular, wanting to get sort of better connected and speak from perhaps the margins as to what our role and responsibility is in culture and in society, and particularly in care of creation.
Lionel?
I have to be mischievous again. I keep thinking as we go through this discussion about paradise and the fact that, believe it or not, it was a nice, healthy Macintosh apple which caused it all, caused the trouble.
It doesn't say that. You need to read the text carefully. It never talks about fruit at all.
Well, apple, remember. and it was, and it's a very interesting metaphor, because you could argue, and I wouldn't be prepared to, except that it's conceivable that intruding into nature by biting the apple, after all, the symbol of Apple, the great colossus of our time, the company, actually was a violation of nature. And that's when original sin began, and there's this weirdness of the serpent, and suddenly people have to start putting on clothes. It is a very bizarre idea. And it's right at the start of one of the really successful books of our world. So I'm merely saying this somewhat puckishly, but realistically, because I think that we're getting at, and I must say that your program has done this admirably, apart from my contribution, in letting people talk about a very serious issue with a method and a generosity that actually speaks to the importance of the issue and the manifold nature of the various approaches to it, which are legitimate.
You know what, Lionel? You're right. That was awfully mischievous, but well played. Well played, I got to say. We've got 2 minutes left. Paul, you want to come in on that?
Well, I think religion has something to say about it, but on the other hand, the fact that religion is allied with something doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. After all, religions, I'm not Dawkins, but religions have many times been associated with wars and with massacres, with the Inquisition, with things that we don't like. So just to say that religion is associated with environmentalism, therefore they're both good, I don't think we can say. I'm not identifying environmentalism with those bad things, but I just don't think we can go directly from saying because religion is allied with environmentalism, environmentalism must be a good thing. And I'm not anti-environment, but I hear people talking about crises, but as Lionel's pointed out and others, we live in a world that's much cleaner than the world I grew up in. The air is much cleaner, the water is much cleaner, and that's good. We've done good things. To an economist, we would say that the measures have shown benefits are greater than costs. So I don't see us in a crisis. Global warming may be an issue. I'm not denying it's an issue, but I don't see it as a crisis issue. I think it's a long-term thing, and we should spend some time figuring out the cheapest way to attack it.
Got 20 seconds left, Elizabeth May. Go ahead.
We actually do know the cheapest ways to attack it, and the reason the air is cleaner now and the water is purer now is because environmental groups forced the changes and governments listened and did them over the objections of the very same kinds of industrialized and economic bodies that now attack environmentalism as a religion. So we've made progress. We just have to stay focused on the goals of ensuring that we transition in a healthy economic fashion away from our addiction to fossil fuels, which has a lot of other good benefits, including avoiding the kinds of disasters that we now see in the Gulf of Mexico.
And I've got 5 seconds left to ask Lionel, how did you get a last name like Tiger? What's the story there?
My father claims that his father shot a tiger in Latvia. And I can ask the World Wildlife Fund people if that's plausible. I doubt it. And so your guess is as good as mine.
Good enough.
But it served me for that branch of show business known as the academic profession.
It sure
I'm
did.
Grateful.
And thank you for God's Brain and for your anthropological work at Rutgers University for being on the program tonight. Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader in Vancouver. Paul Rubin, Emory University in New York. Darwinian Politics, The Evolutionary Origin on Freedom is your book. Stephen Drakeford from the Anglican Minister at St. Matthew's in Etobicoke. Josh Loughran, WWF Canada. Thanks very much.